and welcome everybody. I'd like to speak to you this afternoon about the results of our RAND research on autonomous vehicle technology and focus specifically on the policy and legal implications of this new technology and address that to you because you are our policymakers. And after I give you the briefing on the RAND research, I'd like to turn to three key areas that Brad Holland told me would be of a specific interest to you. And those three areas are, first of all, autonomous vehicle regulation by the states in the US. Secondly, data privacy considerations for autonomous vehicles. And thirdly, commercial truck platooning and the use of truck platooning by the US Army. So before we turn to those subjects, I thought we should have a little fun since it's a little late in the afternoon. So you may think that autonomous vehicle technology is something really new. We've just been thinking about this for the past couple of years. But no, this vision is something that Walt Disney had in 1958. So let's look at the vision from 1958.
Tomorrow's living in spacious, well-planned communities will be closely integrated with the highway system. In the private motor port, the family car is automatically washed, dried, and refueled. As father chooses the route in advance on a push-button selector, electronics take over complete control. Progress can be accurately checked on a synchronized scanning map. With no driving responsibility, the family relaxes together. En route, business conferences are conducted by television.
Well, so are we there yet? So we know that now, current day, autonomous vehicle technology is developing quickly. Google, for example, has traveled over 1 million crash-free miles in the US, and all the major automakers are telling us almost daily in the press about how their efforts toward bringing us autonomous vehicles are progressing. That includes Nissan, Toyota, GM, Ford, all of the major automakers. And when we talk about automated vehicles and autonomous vehicles, I thought I'd just clarify this. Full autonomy means you don't have to have a driver behind the wheel, and the car is operating at what is known as SAE level 5, meaning full autonomy. It's operating itself. But what automakers are working on right now, and you'll see actually in cars that are being produced as early as the next model year, is automated driving, where there are key things like being able to turn on a cruise control on highway driving, crash avoidance systems, lane keeping systems. All these are part of automated driving. Then also, there's a term called connected vehicles, and that refers to cars being able to tell each other where they are, and that's a real safety enhancement. And in the US, that uses dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC, and in Europe, it usually uses 802.11 technology. So automated, autonomous, and connected are all terms that you'll hear me using. But so for now, let's take a look at what's the holdup. Are we all soon going to be driving in our autonomous vehicle, a little bit like George Jetson? Well, let's take a lesson from the past. That may temper our optimism. We'll look at a few examples of technologies and just how quickly they were introduced. For example, airbags were first patented back in 1953, a life-saving technology. But airbags weren't introduced into luxury models of US cars until the 1970s. And then, because of concerns about liability, consumers weren't too interested, and there were some regulatory issues, airbags ended up not being required for inclusion in automobiles in the US until 1999, more than 40 years after that life-saving technology was patented. Similarly, let's look at NHTSA's plan for 1971. That plan was but to reduce auto deaths by 50% by 1980, and it included 4 things: radar-controlled automatic brakes, low tire pressure warning system, a warning for other vehicles of high speeds, and alcohol interlocks. Now, those 4 things, how many do you think are currently put into our tires, put into our cars today? Just one: the low tire pressure warning system. So, what does this show us? Really, that technology is necessary but not sufficient to achieve the benefits that we would like to achieve in society. So let's look at these examples and analyze what went wrong. So we can take a look at autonomous vehicle technology and see what might apply. Well, with those examples that we talked about, with the airbags and with some of the NHTSA ideas, there was automaker opposition, particularly concerns about liability. Also, a lack of consumer support for those new technologies, and the legal underpinnings of the regulatory strategy were overturned. So keep those in mind. So now, considerations for you policymakers. Let's take a look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of automated vehicle technology. We'll look at what obstacles prevent us from realizing these benefits, and then what can policymakers like you do about it. So first, the advantages and disadvantages. First and foremost, autonomous vehicle technology can save lives. Today, there are about 1.2 million traffic fatalities around the world. And in the US, we had last year over 30,000 fatalities and over 2 million injuries from car crashes. And 90% of these were due to human error. So if we can reduce human error by introducing automated and autonomous vehicle technologies, which are never distracted or texting or drowsy, think how we might be able to reduce the numbers of deaths and injuries. Another benefit is to improve mobility. This is a picture of a gentleman who is blind, who was taken, a Google car took him to a Taco Bell to get a sandwich. So obviously he thinks that's really pretty great. But in addition to taking people on a ride to a fast food place, this will allow people who have disabilities who can't drive to get to their jobs, to interact with friends, to be much more involved in society. And there are millions of people, Americans, Canadians, and worldwide, who currently can't drive, who could be more integrated into society with autonomous vehicles. Fuel consumption. If we're able to really reduce the number of crashes, perhaps we can reduce the weight of cars. And if we reduce the weight of cars, and that weight is created by their additional crash worthiness, but if we're able to reduce that weight, then potentially cars will consume less fuel. And with lower fuel consumption, we may have lower emissions, so a benefit for the environment. Another fascinating thing we learned in our study, land use. Right now, in the 31 major cities that we looked at, about 30% of the inner city core space is dedicated to parking. Well, imagine if cars autonomously could go and park themselves on the perimeter of a city or head off and take somebody else to work or do something else. So they don't have to park in that core area of the city. So that really raises fascinating ideas for what cities may look like in the future. Another important aspect would be a reduction in congestion. Autonomous vehicles would be able to follow each other much more closely, and lanes could be more narrow, which means you'd have greater throughput of the traffic, which may reduce congestion. And we would love that in Washington, D.C. But the flip side, it might actually increase congestion if, for example, since you can be more productive in your autonomous vehicle, you can, remember the Walt Disney video clip, you can take your business conference, you can write emails, you can text. People may decide to live further away from the urban centers and then commute into the cities. So we might actually have greater congestion. We're not sure. Another potential disadvantage is the impact on public transit. Right now, a lot of people enjoy public transit because they can leave the driving to somebody else. They can talk to a friend or do their emails or read a book. But in the future, if you can do that with your own fully autonomous vehicle, you may not be so interested in public transit. And that may have a really negative impact on those people who need to take public transit because the revenues will have decreased, and so that's going to impact the public transit that many people rely on. Another area we found in our research is potential economic disruption. For example, in the United States, we have around 900,000 truck drivers and 170,000 taxi drivers. Well, if the fleets really become fully autonomous, those people may no longer have a job. This is not immediate, but that's potential. Another aspect is what we call the crash economy. This is all the way from the people who fix the cars at the automobile repair shop to the emergency rooms where the doctors and nurses take care of the people that have been involved in the crashes, to the insurance adjusters who pay for it all. And there are about 300,000 insurance and claims adjusters right now in the U.S., and of course, many doctors and nurses and other people involved in the crash economy. And so their jobs may change. Now let's talk about those parking revenues that I mentioned earlier. You know, it'd be really cool if cars could park themselves on the perimeter of a city, but guess what? You probably know this very well. Many cities depend on the revenues that they get from parking and from parking tickets. New York City alone received $600 million in parking ticket revenue last year, and they used that to fund a lot of their other transportation infrastructure. So cities and municipalities may need to look for another source of revenue if autonomous vehicle technology is fully implemented. But these overall societal benefits that we discussed surely outweigh some of the disadvantages. I mean, just to say again, in congestion costs so much in terms of people's lost productivity. A Texas Transportation Institute study showed that Americans lose the equivalent of billions of dollars in the hours that they spend stuck in traffic. We could change that. Land use, we could take our cities back from the parking lots. Fuel consumption, we've all wanted that to go down. And we could improve lives with additional mobility. And most importantly, we could save lives. So all in all, these are benefits that surely outweigh the downsides. So what are the obstacles that prevent us from gaining these benefits? Well, first of all, we found that, as a colleague of mine says, it's the Lake Wobegon effect. Garrison Keillor's fictional town where everybody believes that their children are above average. Well, we found that people generally believe, actually 90% of people believe, that their driving skills are above average. So maybe they will feel they don't need to have an autonomous vehicle that's safer than what they're driving. Similarly, automakers have historically had a concern that safety just does not sell. So maybe they don't want to add in more expensive technology and take a risk to selling those kind of automobiles. And another concern is that at the early stages of automation, which are coming to us very soon, we will have to have trained and alert drivers. So that question of liability comes up again when cars are not fully autonomous but are actually going to have drivers be able to take over the driving when they receive an alert. So all of this creates what economists like to call an externality story. And basically that is where consumers may think that they don't really get all the benefits of this new technology, that the benefits instead really accrue to the society and not to them. So for example, if I'm looking into buying an autonomous vehicle sometime in the future, well, it's good for my mobility. Yeah, that's a benefit that I get. But safety, I don't really get the benefits unless everybody's driving an autonomous vehicle. Similarly with congestion, maybe I can be more productive, but yet the congestion out there on the roadway may not really have decreased unless the whole society has these cars. And similarly, energy consumption, overall, that's a benefit more for the society than for me. And emissions, similarly, social benefit. And land use, that accrues to the society, not to me. So these are all concerns about whether and why people will adopt autonomous vehicle technology. And then there's that issue that we were talking about with airbags and some of these other technology innovations, and that is automaker liability. Right now, if there's a car crash, generally, one of the two drivers is considered to be liable and the reason for it. But as we move into a scenario where automakers are creating the technology in the cars, and the cars are perhaps driving, that may change the liability equation. So the concern is that these factors together might result in market failure. And what do I mean by market failure? Well, what would happen if the automakers didn't want to make the cars and consumers didn't want to buy the cars? Well, then you have market failure. And what's the real risk of that? Well, with slow adoption, then we could have a lot of lives lost unnecessarily. So what can policymakers like you do? Well, economists will tell us that for the kind of externality scenario that we just talked about, the way to deal with that is through subsidies, privileges, mandates, user fees. Think of the introduction of the hybrid car in the US. Their consumers were able to use special lanes, and they got subsidies. There were other privileges that were given to them. And so this was a way to equalize public and private benefits. And we really need to explore what sort of public and private benefits would help us speed the deployment of autonomous vehicles. More research needs to be done there. Another thing that might really help is liability law changes. For example, perhaps we could clarify liability standards. Right now in products liability law, an automaker, for example, could not introduce how a new technology has saved lives in general. But maybe being able to introduce information like that in defense might help as we go forward. Another thing is that in the US, there could be federal preemption of state tort remedies. So there'd be a federal framework instead of the state framework, or as here we would have the provincial framework in Canada. Or a really interesting idea, perhaps we'll take a chapter from maritime law and the operator will be given full responsibility for the vehicle. Just like the captain is responsible for his or her ship, the operator would be responsible for his or her vehicle, whether or not that person was driving. But one of the most important messages from our research is that collaboration is key. First of all, that's because technology is varying and progressing right now, and we all know that technology develops quickly. So you don't want to set any policies or certifications or requirements in place too quickly, because that could really hold technology development back. Also, states, and I would add provinces, should really coordinate on their regulations so we don't have a patchwork of different certification requirements across the states or across the provinces. Because we all know that premature regulation could halt the evolution of this important technology. There are also challenges for transportation planners. I knew we'd have transportation planners here, so I wanted to talk to your challenges especially. For example, the way that you do your planning may need to change and modify. Instead of looking at just historical information, you may also need to look at possible future scenarios, which will include automated and autonomous vehicles. And this is what at RAND we call adaptive policy making. So you need the information to create scenarios that are robust enough to look at different possible outcomes and the policies that would go along with that. And of course, you'll need to collect information so you can do that. And I know that's preaching to the choir, but you will definitely need to have more information. So the key points are the benefits outweigh the disadvantages of this new technology, but the purchaser does not get all the benefits and may be unwilling to pay for it. Subsidies could help, and adaptive policymaking on your part is critical. So in the US, states have looked at whether autonomous vehicles should be regulated, and some of them have said no, 5 of them have said yes, and some of them have said maybe. As you probably know, California and Nevada, Michigan, Florida, and DC have all enacted legislation concerning the testing of autonomous vehicles. And since Brad asked me to give you some examples of best practices or what's going on in the US, I thought that I'd say that, frankly, California, as usual, is out there in front. And so they have been the most aggressive in developing regulations for autonomous vehicles. And just for example, automakers are going to have a $5 million bond or insurance to test on California highways. The manufacturer has to demonstrate that they've tested in simulated conditions that are very like real on-road conditions. And as somebody pointed out, the test driver must be seated in the driver's seat while the testing is going on. And the test driver has certain requirements. For example, the driver has to report any accident within 10 days, and any problems with the autonomous technology, like disengagements, have to be reported annually, and that testing permit is valid for a year. So think about it. Autonomous vehicle technology is really going to produce challenges for the state regulatory process or the provincial regulatory process. For example, there's a really new role for State Department of Motor Vehicles in the US. I venture to say that'll be pretty similar here in Canada. And the federal motor vehicle safety standards or other standards are just not fully developed and for autonomous vehicles. And the key topics that regulators would look at to give them guidance and counsel on developing those guidelines are still really in a research state. So the big question is, how regulations will ultimately integrate with the actions by other states or provinces, or at the federal level, how the federal level is going to interact with the provincial or state level, and internationally. So back to California, I thought you might be interested in some of these certifications. Specifically, automakers have to certify that the autonomous vehicle has a mechanism, to your point, to easily engage or disengage the autonomous vehicle technology. There also has to be a visual indicator that the autonomous technology is on. And then there has to be a system to alert the driver of a malfunction of the autonomous vehicle technology. And then this I find very, very interesting, this separate mechanism to record sensor data 30 seconds prior to collision that I mentioned previously, the separate an additional black box. So that's something that automakers are concerned about, having different requirements from different states with what they have to put on an autonomous vehicle. And this separate mechanism is something that is also required by Nevada, in addition to California. So here's some of the conditions for driving and operating an autonomous vehicle in California. An automaker has to identify all the areas where the vehicle can operate and basically certify where it can't operate. Has to talk about and identify those restricted areas or the restricted circumstances. For example, maybe it can't drive in snow or ice or fog or in construction zones. They have to also identify what the vehicle will do if the technology fails. For example, will there be a safe harbor? For example, the car will just go slowly to the curb and stop. And then finally, they'll have to certify that the technology will obey all traffic laws. So, taking a look at this, here are the considerations for you policymakers. What are the applicable standards and certifications? And who sets them? Is it going to be the federal government? Is it going to be the province? Will it be the manufacturer? Or maybe a third party? And then, importantly, how are regulatory and certification frameworks going to be harmonized across the US, certainly, but across Canada, and then across the US, Canada, and Mexico, and internationally. So, again, collaboration is key. And remember, regulation can delay the deployment of life-saving technologies. And we need to address collaboratively what standards can be used to certify those technologies. And the bottom line here, that regulatory and certification frameworks need to be harmonized across the US, Canada, and continents. So, shall we take a look at the data privacy considerations for autonomous and connected vehicles? I'd like to give you the findings, a brief on the findings of a project that we did for the Texas Transportation Institute, which is part of Texas A&M University. And specifically, The Policy Research Center there supplies information to the Texas legislature. And the Texas legislature was interested in knowing whether there's a need for new policies to manage vehicular and transportation data that's collected and used by the states as these new technologies are developed, and whether there should be a state or a federal approach to managing these data privacy issues. So our report explains how new technologies may challenge existing data privacy protections. And we looked at smartphones in addition to autonomous vehicles, but we used autonomous vehicle technology and the data privacy issues embedded there as our case study. And some of the things that we focused on were, first of all, the debate about data de-identification. Some people call this data anonymization. The idea that you can really scrub away all personally identifiable information from data, and then it's not a problem. So we learned there's a big debate about that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The next finding that we had is that the auto industry really lacks consensus about how to protect drivers' data. And in fact, Senator Markey has been very vociferous about how automakers are going to protect people's data privacy going forward. We also learned that consumers are willing to trade their personal data to obtain a benefit. Now, all of you who have smartphones and you have downloaded a mobile app, and you're supposed to go through the privacy policy and click, I agree, and somewhere in that policy you probably know that the app is going to say that it's going to use your data for something, but you go ahead and click, I agree, because you want to use the app. That's the kind of exchange of data for a benefit that I'm talking about. Another example is some insurers are offering people the opportunity to put kind of a black box or something on their car to monitor their driving habits in response for potentially lower rates. So again, you're giving up your data to get a benefit. But interestingly, AAA in the US found that when they did a poll of over 1,000 adults in the US and asked them whether they thought that there should be laws and policies to protect their vehicle data, 86% said yes. And I learned just a month or so ago that there's a new Canadian Automobile Association survey that shows just the same thing. So we have a real duality here in terms of how people will exchange data for a benefit, but on the other hand, they're concerned about the use of the data that could come from their car. I thought it'd be interesting to contrast the privacy protections we have in the US with what you have here in Canada. In the US, we have federal statutes that cover specific aspects of privacy protection: financial information, medical information, children's use of the internet. And this is in contrast to the Canadian approach, which is much more all-encompassing. For example, in the US, we do not have a consistent statutory definition of personally identifying information. And that's a problem because with location information, when you can team up where a car is, its location, and information about who the individual is, then that's personally identifiable information. We interviewed lots of state departments of transportation and subject matter experts, industry stakeholders, and privacy experts. And here are 4 of the really key questions that we asked them that I'd like to tell you about. First of all, how are vehicular data being collected in Texas and in other states? How are transportation data being used? Third, this is my personal favorite, who owns or can access and use the data? And then what's the value of vehicular data? So let's look at who owns or can use the data first. Well, we found in our study that drivers think that they may own or control their car's data, but that is not necessarily so. We talked to insurers, for example, who believe that if they have a subscription agreement with you, that they own and can use the data from your car. Secondly, we talked to OEMs, manufacturers, and although they are quick to say that the owner of the vehicle owns the data, they believe that they can use the data to improve the car itself and the technology. So different stakeholders have different views. And we also learned that, for example, there's some telematic devices that are being installed in many new cars today that transmit personally identifiable information, like location information, and that's whether the driver likes it or not. So there have been calls for a kind of a Bill of Rights or legislation in the U.S., for example, in California and in Connecticut, but none of that legislation has been enacted. We also learned that states and private entities are planning to use and monetize automated and connected vehicle data. And that includes, as we were talking about, manufacturers, telematics, developers, insurance companies, and in addition to those private parties, we learned that states are hoping to monetize the data that they're collecting anyway. They need revenues, they're collecting this data. Many people think this would be a great way to subsidize their transportation plans. And because they're going to need this data for traffic control and management. We also learned in talking to experts that states are going to face what one of the experts we talked about was a tsunami, just a huge amount of data that was going to be coming to them from automated and connected vehicles. And we also learned that for whatever reasons, I'm sure you can understand, budget limitations, planning limitations, they just have not figured out how they could plan to use, manage, secure this data. And if we think ahead, if states aren't able to, or provinces aren't able to manage and secure this information, what are they likely to do? Well, turn to third parties who can do it for them. Well, the key issue then is what are the contractual requirements that are going to be placed on those third parties about how the third parties might use or analyze or share that data. To do that, the states or the provinces are going to need good guidance and about what's required so that they can control the use of automated or connected vehicle data that has personally identifiable data embedded in it. So now we talked a little bit about data anonymization or de-identification. And we had experts who spanned the gamut. We had one person from a state DOT who told us, we do all of our data collection in the field, it's hashed. There's no way that personally identifiable information can still be in there when we aggregate it. It's no problem. This is the silver bullet. Then we talked to other experts who said, you take that information that people think has been anonymized, you run it against 2 or 3 other databases, and voila, you've recreated the data that is linked to the person. So there's a big debate going on. And recently, there was a Massachusetts Institute of Technology study where the researchers took 3,000 credit card transactions that were fully anonymized, no personally identifiable information at all. And they found if they had just 4 pieces of information, and those were location and time of transaction, they were able to recreate with over 90% certainty who the individual was who had made that transaction. So that really should set us to thinking. Location, okay, cars, you'll have the location. Time, well, you'll probably have the time when that data is created. So definitely that may put the way that we're trying to protect our personally identifiable information into question. And frankly, there are just no standards right now for how data de-anonymization or anonymization, data anonymization should be carried out right now. And finally, a question that was very interesting. We asked everybody we interviewed, what do you think? Should it be a federal standard or approach to regulation, or should the states handle it? And the responses came out almost exactly 50-50. We heard from the automakers and the insurance companies that they were very concerned about a patchwork of state legislation, so they were all in favor of the federal approach. But then we talked to some very thoughtful people who said, oh, no, no, no. States should take the way, lead the way, as they have on so many other topics, because then the feds will look at the best models of state legislation, and that'll move things forward. And then we talked to some people who are really politically astute, and they said, well, if the feds try to really push guidelines or regulations down the throat of some states, it's just not going to work. There'll be pushback, and that would slow the deployment of the technologies. But we're hearing that NHTSA was just mentioned, as my colleague from AMVA, is going to be coming out with new guidelines for the states about autonomous vehicle regulation. Some rumors say that it might even be as soon as next month, but we don't know. So there will be action on this part, so you'll be seeing more about this pretty soon. Commercial with truck platooning. I know one person in this room is familiar with it. How many people have heard about commercial truck platooning? Okay, great, everybody. So, as you all know, platooning is facilitated by wireless communications between the lead truck and the following truck and sensors such as LiDAR and radar and GPS. And the commercial benefits of platooning are particularly fuel savings and a reduction of driver fatigue, among other things. The estimates are that there's a fuel savings for the rear truck of about 10% and about 4.5% on the front truck. And fuel savings are really important because fuel costs are a critical element of the commercial trucking business. So, in addition to the fuel savings, there would be an opportunity to reduce driver fatigue and also potentially more efficient use of those commercial trucking assets. So in the US, the states really set the criteria for how platooning can be deployed. The federal agencies are supporting the development of best practices. Now, the states present real regulatory challenges for those who would like to create a platooning business model. Some states, like California, for example, have requirements about following distance. In California, you're not allowed to have a caravan. Other states require you to have a 3-second following distance. But Utah, for example, made an exception to its 2-second following distance rule for connected vehicles. But the majority of states right now use a reasonable and prudent standard. But yet, it's not a full 50-state availability for platooning, so that's a regulatory issue that has to be resolved. So the challenges to deployment of platooning really may be greater from regulation than from technology. Hey, it's coming. Take a look. There's no driver in this cab. This is the Freightliner that was licensed for road driving in Nevada back in 2015. And just last April, this past April, There was the European Truck Platooning Challenge where different trucking companies like Scania, Mercedes, Daimler, and others started from different points of Europe. They crossed the borders of different countries and arrived in Rotterdam successfully as a demonstration of truck platooning. So it's definitely coming. Now let's talk a little bit about how the U.S. Army is exploring autonomous convoys. And as opposed to fuel efficiency, the Army is looking at force protection, protecting soldiers from losing their lives, for example, in long convoys. Think of Afghanistan or Iraq, where there are 30 trucks and the bad guys can see them coming and use IEDs to create havoc. So RAND is working on a study right now, and the study purpose is to provide analysis to the Army about how they can implement automated and autonomous vehicle technologies for use in combat logistics operations. And here, this is the thing I really wanted to discuss with you. Take a look at how the commercial factors stack up with the Army's factors. We know that on the commercial side, improved fuel efficiency is important, leveraging established infrastructure and working within the U.S. regulatory environment. On the military side, though, the key factors are reducing the risk to personnel, being able to go off-road where there's no infrastructure in rough terrain and austere conditions. But there are 4 key issues that are common to both the military and the commercial side, and that is communications, human-machine interface, how humans are dealing with the technology, cybersecurity, and sustainment and maintenance. So the key points here are that commercial platooning presents significant economic incentives and that the challenges to deployment may be greater from regulation than from technology. Remember that military applications offer force protection in conflict environments. And finally, platooning illustrates the need for harmonization of regulatory and certification frameworks across borders. I want to thank you so much for joining in this discussion with me. It's really been interesting. Thanks a lot.